Hey guys! Tonight we're leaving the drawbridges down and the lights dimmed. Because tonight's story isn't about wars or glory or coronations. It's about silence. About what happens when all that power, all that silk, marble and ceremony, quietly turns against the people living inside it. So if you're ready, grab a blanket, settle in, and let the walls close in, softly of course. Welcome to When Royal Palaces Became Prisons. There's a certain irony to it, isn't there? You spend your life building walls to keep the world out, and then one day, those same walls keep you in. Kings and queens surrounded by guards, gold and courtiers, but no freedom. A palace can feel like heaven until the door locks from the outside. Let's start with someone who knew that feeling all too well. Mary, Queen of Scots, the royal guest who couldn't leave. Mary Stuart, born in a palace, crowned at 9 months old, and, as history insists, destined to spend half her life in captivity, which is really just royal-sounding code for glorified house arrest. Her story begins in Scotland, which, if you've ever been there, is basically mist, castles, and political backstabbing. Mary had it all: the beauty, the bloodline, and the very unfortunate luck of being a queen surrounded by men who wanted her job. After her disastrous marriage to Lord Darnley, a man whose main achievement was being spectacularly murdered in a suspicious explosion, Mary's reign sort of imploded. She fled to England, hoping her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I, might offer her shelter, or at least a decent guest room. Elizabeth did offer her a room, and then another, and another, for 19 years. Because when a royal guest overstays her welcome, that's called imprisonment with extra steps. Now, Elizabeth didn't exactly throw Mary into a dungeon. That would have been too uncivilized, and far too damp for royal bones. Instead, she kept her in a rotating series of castles and manors across England. Now, Elizabeth didn't exactly throw Mary into a dungeon. That would have been too uncivilized, and far too damp for royal bones. Instead, she kept her in a rotating series of castles and manors across England, places with names like Tutbury, Sheffield, and Chartley. Each one had slightly different decor, but the same central feature: guards. Lots of them. Mary's days were quiet. She prayed, embroidered, and occasionally plotted Elizabeth's assassination, as one does when your cousin's holding you hostage in velvet captivity. Her captors made sure she had comforts, servants, fine meals, even her own furniture. But the windows were barred, and the exits were locked. Imagine it. Golden chandeliers overhead, tapestries on the walls, and the soft echo of footsteps that aren't yours, guards pacing outside your door. A palace that feels like a cage. Mary aged in those rooms. Her once famous beauty faded, her health declined, and her letters, filled with Catholic hope and coded schemes, eventually betrayed her. In 1587, she was executed at Fotheringhay Castle, after nearly 2 decades of luxurious imprisonment. A queen, decapitated not for treason alone, but for being too dangerous to leave free. Let's drift eastward now. Another palace. Another prisoner. But this time, it's not Tudor England. It's Russia, where confinement came with chandeliers, orthodox icons, and very chilly corridors. Tsar Ivan VI, the baby who was born a prisoner. If you thought your childhood was rough, try being Tsar Ivan VI. He was crowned Emperor of Russia at just 2 months old, which, to be fair, is a solid resume line for an infant. But within a year, his family was overthrown by a distant relative, the future Empress Elizabeth, who decided the empire didn't need another baby in charge. So, what do you do with a deposed royal toddler? In Russia, apparently, you hide him. Ivan was taken away, first with his parents, then alone, shuttled between fortresses and monasteries. No one outside his guards even knew what he looked like. He spent his life in silence, a human secret, locked in a palace-shaped box. By the time he reached adulthood, Ivan had no idea what freedom meant. He'd never left his gilded cells, never met a friend, never ruled a single day. When Catherine the Great came to power decades later, she discovered this living ghost, the forgotten Tsar locked away like a cursed relic. She considered freeing him for about 5 minutes, before deciding that would be politically inconvenient. Ivan died the way he lived, behind walls, killed by his own guards during an escape attempt he barely understood. A man born to rule an empire, but never allowed to step outside his room. And maybe that's the thing about royal captivity. It's never about iron bars or chains. It's about being surrounded by everything, except choice. Let's move a little closer to Western Europe again, where the air smells faintly of perfume and political betrayal. Because if Mary and Ivan were prisoners of circumstance, the next monarch was a prisoner of appearance. Marie Antoinette, the queen who couldn't escape herself. Ah yes, Marie Antoinette, the woman who allegedly told her starving people to eat cake, which she didn't, but at this point, history isn't really in the business of fact-checking. Born in Vienna, shipped off to France at 14 to marry the Dauphin, she lived her youth as a walking symbol of elegance, excess, and mild confusion. Versailles was her home, her stage, her trap. Because Versailles, as palaces go, wasn't built for comfort. It was built for surveillance, a place where nobles elbowed for attention, and every royal sneeze had witnesses. Privacy didn't exist. Marie's mornings began with courtiers dressing her like she was a public art installation. She tried to carve out solitude, retreating to her little cottage, the Petit Trianon, where she played shepherdess, with silk ribbons and porcelain milk pails, naturally. But even there, she was still the queen, still watched, still trapped in the golden fishbowl of monarchy. When the revolution came, that fishbowl shattered, but not in the liberating way. Marie and Louis XVI were moved from Versailles to the Tuileries Palace in Paris, their new home, heavily guarded, surrounded by mobs and soldiers. Then to the Temple prison. Then to the conciergerie, the stone waiting room of the guillotine. The queen who once ruled the most glittering court in Europe ended her days in a small damp cell, hair cut short, hands bound, dignity quietly crumbling. Versailles had been her palace. The conciergerie became her mirror, showing her what all that beauty had really been worth. So far, we've had queens and emperors, toddlers and revolutionaries, all trapped behind walls that once symbolized safety. And there are so many more, each palace a little world of its own, echoing with quiet footsteps and unspoken regrets. But before we drift to the next royal ghost in their velvet cage, take a breath. The story moves slowly here. History, after all, doesn't rush when it's standing still. Because we're heading even deeper into the echoing corridors of royal loneliness, where the carpets are soft, the ceilings high, and the exits sealed shut. If part 1 was about queens who traded thrones for silence, part 2 is about emperors who learned that power can vanish behind their own palace gates. So let's dim the lights again, take a slow breath, and drift toward the east. To a boy who was born a god, and died as a museum piece. Emperor Pu-yi, the last emperor in his own cage. If there's one royal who defined luxury as imprisonment, it's Pu-yi. Born in 1906, he was crowned emperor of China at the age of 2. And if that sounds like an impressive career milestone, remember, he didn't actually do anything. At the Forbidden City in Beijing, he sat on a throne taller than he was, while grown men bowed to him and called him Son of Heaven. It must have been confusing. Imagine being told you rule all under heaven, but you still need permission to have snacks. When the Qing dynasty collapsed in 1912, little Pu-yi technically abdicated, though he had no idea what that meant. The revolutionaries decided to let him stay in the palace. Because, what harm could a toddler emperor possibly do? So there he stayed. A dethroned emperor still living in imperial splendor, surrounded by eunuchs, courtyards, and ancient rituals that no longer meant anything. The world outside was changing. Inside the Forbidden City, Puyi was frozen in time. A relic in silk robes, ruling no one, imprisoned by ceremony. His life was a strange mixture of opulence and emptiness. He had everything except freedom, and eventually, he wasn't even allowed that. When he was expelled from the Forbidden City in 1924, he drifted between foreign powers, Japanese handlers, and his own delusions of returning to power. By the 1930s, Japan had found a use for him, as the puppet emperor of their colony Manchukuo. They gave him palaces again, guards, titles, all the decor of a monarchy, except the power. It was captivity masquerading as majesty. Every move he made was scripted, every word monitored. His throne was made of gold, but his leash was invisible. When Japan lost World War II, Puyi was captured, again, this time by the Soviets. He spent years in prison camps, then was handed over to communist China, where he became a humble gardener. From son of heaven to assistant botanist. He later wrote, with calm irony, that prison was the first time he'd ever felt free. Because for the first time, he wasn't pretending to be a god. Let's float westward, from Beijing's courtyards to the windy, salty loneliness of the Mediterranean, where one man built an empire, and then spent his final years pacing a rock. Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of Nowhere. Napoleon is one of those figures who's either a hero, a tyrant, or, if you're British, an extremely short inconvenience. He rose from nothing, conquered Europe, crowned himself emperor, and then learned the hard way that geography doesn't forgive arrogance. After losing his first empire, he was sent into exile on the island of Elba. Now, Elba sounds exotic, but it's really just a scenic rock with a few goats and far too many hills. Napoleon, being Napoleon, immediately started acting like it was a mini France. He built a palace, formed a tiny army, held parades, basically turned exile into cosplay. But the funny thing about being an emperor on a small island is that everyone knows you can't leave. Every step, every letter, every visitor, watched. Freedom, but fenced in by sea. And because Napoleon's ego was too large for Elba, he escaped, naturally, to reclaim France, which went about as well as you'd expect. A brief comeback, a crushing defeat, and then the final act, St. Helena. If Elba was a gilded retreat, St. Helena was a punishment. A volcanic rock in the middle of the South Atlantic, so remote that even birds looked bored. He spent 6 years there, pacing, dictating his memoirs, and arguing with his British jailers about furniture arrangements. His palace was a damp farmhouse. His court was reduced to a few loyal servants. His empire, a fading memory in the fog. When he finally died in 1821, they buried him under a willow tree. A man who once ruled millions, ending his days as a captive tourist attraction. It's strange how often that happens, isn't it? How the throne and the prison cell can end up looking eerily alike. Empress Elizabeth of Austria, Sisi, the queen who locked herself away. Now, let's glide to Vienna, where chandeliers sparkle, waltzes echo, and one empress spent her life running away from her own palace. Elizabeth of Austria, better known as Sisi, was, in theory, the most glamorous woman in 19th century Europe. In practice, she was miserable. Married young to Emperor Franz Joseph, she entered a world of rules, routines, and endless etiquette. The Habsburg court was like living inside a clock. Every hour, every meal, every breath accounted for. And Sisi hated it. She was beautiful, yes, the sort of beauty that painters idealized and poets wrote about. But she was also trapped. Every movement watched, every word whispered about, every emotion documented in public gossip. So she began to escape. Physically, at first, traveling constantly, spending as little time as possible in Vienna. Then emotionally, disappearing into poetry, melancholy, and obsessive fitness routines that made her attendants dizzy. They said she had the freedom of an empress. But freedom means nothing when you can't go anywhere without being followed by 100 eyes. In the end, her palace was her prison, and her escape was movement itself. She died far from home, in Geneva, killed by an assassin who didn't even know who she was. A woman who spent her life trying to vanish, finally did. It's strange how many of these royal stories end the same way. Not in glory or conquest, but in stillness, in long hallways, in locked doors, in the quiet realization that power doesn't protect you from being trapped, it just gives your cage better curtains. Let's drift gently now, toward one last story before the night gets deeper. A king who ruled, abdicated, and learned that love can be its own form of confinement. Edward VIII, the king who chose his cage. Edward VIII had everything a modern monarch could want: fame, charm, adoration, and a perfectly good empire. And then he fell in love with Wallis Simpson, a twice-divorced American socialite. The British government said, absolutely not. The church said, even more absolutely not. So Edward said, well, I'll just quit then. In 1936, he abdicated, stepping down from the throne for what he called the woman I love. It sounded romantic at the time. In reality, it was just the beginning of another kind of confinement. After the abdication, Edward became the Duke of Windsor, with all the trappings of royalty and none of the relevance. He and Wallis lived in exile, moving between villas, manors, and palaces they didn't own, adored by the press and ignored by history. They threw parties. They smiled for photographers. They wore crowns made of nostalgia. But under all that glitter, there was something hollow, the same emptiness that echoes through every palace-turned-prison. A man who gave up the crown, only to realize that the world had already locked him out. Power, it turns out, is never just about control. It's about the illusion of freedom, and the quiet horror of realizing it was never yours. So if you're still here, still drifting through these stories, remember that the walls of history are full of echoes, of queens who embroidered their own despair, of emperors who wrote memoirs no one read, of kings who traded freedom for love, and found they'd only changed the shape of the cage. The palaces are empty now. The guards are gone. But somewhere in the silence, the floorboard still creak, softly. Not from ghosts, just from memory. Hey again. If you're still awake, congratulations. You've officially outlasted several monarchies. We floated through the lonely gardens of exiled emperors and runaway queens, and now we're gliding into the colder, quieter prisons, the kind that hide behind polite smiles and chandeliers. Let's start with a man who ruled half of Europe but couldn't control his own palace. A king who learned that absolute power was often just an absolute mess. King George III, the monarch who lost his mind and his freedom. George III, the British king who managed to lose America, his sanity, and eventually his own liberty. He reigned for 60 years, which sounds impressive until you realize that for a good chunk of that time, he wasn't really in charge. By the end of his life, George was trapped not by rebels or invaders, but by his own mind. Madness, they called it then. probably a mix of bipolar disorder and a genetic blood condition called porphyria. But back then, mental health wasn't a concept, it was a scandal. When the fits began, the royal doctors rushed in with the 18th century equivalent of therapy: leeches, bleeding, and shouting. The palace staff whispered. Ministers panicked. And the royal family did what royal families often do when things get uncomfortable: they hid him. George was confined to Windsor Castle, his windows barred, his letters filtered. He wandered the halls singing hymns, speaking to the portraits, sometimes convinced he was talking to angels. The King of England had become a patient. His court turned into a sick room, his crown little more than a memory. And yet, his confinement was dignified in the strangest way. He wasn't chained or humiliated. He was simply forgotten. When he died in 1820, blind and alone, the official bulletin spoke gently, "His Majesty passed peacefully." Which was true. But it didn't mention that his final years had been spent as a ghost in his own castle. Let's quietly sail north now, to Sweden, where another monarch discovered that you can abdicate the throne, but never the expectations that come with it. Queen Christina of Sweden, the philosopher in the cage. Christina was not your typical 17th century monarch. She was brilliant, eccentric, allergic to marriage, and suspiciously fond of wearing men's clothes. Which, for a Lutheran kingdom obsessed with order and heirs, was awkward. She ruled Sweden from 1632 to 1654, after inheriting the throne as a child. Her court called her the Northern Minerva, the goddess of wisdom, though privately, they thought she was a bit too clever for her own good. Christina loved art, literature, and philosophy, basically everything her advisors found unproductive. They wanted a queen to marry and produce an heir. She wanted to talk about Descartes. Eventually, she abdicated, voluntarily, shocking everyone. She said she was tired of the crown's burden. In reality, she was tired of being trapped by it. But her escape didn't bring peace. After converting to Catholicism and moving to Rome, she found herself confined in a different way. By gossip, religion, and suspicion. Her new freedom was just another form of exile. She lived in a lavish palace, surrounded by scholars and intrigue, spending her days writing letters and her nights hosting salons where everyone debated whether she was a genius or insane. Christina once said, "I was born free, and I will die free." But when she did die in 1689, it was in yet another palace, her rooms filled with books, paintings, and the same solitude she had tried so hard to escape. Now, let's move south, to Russia. A land where palaces were as grand as they were dangerous. Where family dinners sometimes came with a side of assassination. And where one woman decided that her husband's incompetence was grounds for career advancement. Peter III of Russia, the emperor who lasted 6 months. Peter III wasn't supposed to be emperor for long, and history made sure of it. He was the husband of Catherine the Great, a man whose greatest achievements included insulting the army, alienating the nobles, and making everyone deeply uncomfortable. Peter loved Prussia more than Russia, idolized Frederick the Great, and reportedly spent more time playing with toy soldiers than governing real ones. His court thought he was childish. His wife thought he was dangerous. When Catherine staged her coup in 1762, it was swift, efficient, and terrifyingly polite. Peter was forced to abdicate and sent to a quiet country palace under protective custody. Translation: he was imprisoned with a good view. He lasted just 8 days. Officially, he died of hemorrhoidal colic. Unofficially, he was strangled, possibly by Catherine's supporters, possibly by accident. It's hard to say. Russia is excellent at unclear endings. But what's strange about Peter's story is how ordinary it felt, at least by royal standards. Because in Russia, imprisonment was practically part of the job description. Ivan VI, the forgotten Tsar. Before Peter III, there was Ivan VI, a baby emperor who never even got to rule. Crowned as an infant in 1740, he was overthrown before his first birthday and spent his entire life locked away in various fortresses. He grew up in silence, never learning to read or speak properly. His only company the guards who rotated to make sure he didn't form attachments. By adulthood, he barely understood who he was. When a group of soldiers tried to free him in 1764, the guards panicked and killed him on the spot. No one was punished. The Empress simply ordered the prison cell sealed. A lifetime of royal blood, reduced to an unmarked grave. You start to notice a pattern after a while, don't you? For every coronation, there's a locked room somewhere waiting. For every crown, a key turned quietly in the dark. Maria Theresa of Spain, the queen who faded in her own palace. Let's visit one more, Madrid, 17th century. Maria Theresa, the Spanish queen and wife of Louis XIV of France. She was born into grandeur, married into even grander misery. Louis, the Sun King, had mistresses, wars, and mirrors to adore himself in. Maria had embroidery. She lived in Versailles, the most beautiful prison in Europe. Endless corridors, gilded ceilings, hundreds of courtiers, and not one real friend. They said she smiled sweetly and spoke little. She was surrounded by people every moment of her life, yet completely alone. When she died, Louis barely paused before returning to his mistresses. Her rooms were cleaned, her portraits moved, and that was that. Versailles went on glittering. But one of its brightest lights had quietly gone out, unnoticed. So much of royalty, when you look closely, is really just elegant captivity. Gilded walls, golden cages, some locked by enemies, some by duty, some by the weight of expectation. And the strangest thing? They all believed, at some point, that they were free. Soft pause. So, if you're still awake, we'll keep floating in the next part to even darker corners. To emperors in exile, queens in towers, and princes who never saw daylight again. Because history's most beautiful prisons weren't always made of stone. Sometimes, they were built out of power itself.